Welcome to Section 420, Talkin Yankees. My next guest is baseball writer Rocco Constantino. He has a weekly show on ball9.com called Spitballing, where he speaks to former major league players. And he most recently wrote a book called Beyond Baseball's Color Barrier, which discusses African-American baseball from 1879 to present day. So let's bring him on. Hi, Rocco. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, James. Great to be here. I appreciate you having me on Section 420, Talking Yankees, and ready to talk some baseball with you.
Awesome, man. And it's good because, I spoke to Chris Vitale from Bull 9, who you associated with, a little over a year ago. So it was just great to also have you on. Now, people can follow you on Twitter, official MLB RFC, as well as check out your website, roccoconstantino.com, where they can learn a little bit more about you and to see some of the books you've written. So we'll get into your most recent title, Beyond Baseball's Color Barrier. But people can catch you almost every week now on ball9.com, where you have your show Spitballing, where you talk to a lot of former major league players.
Yeah, it's great. That's been a blast to do. I've been going on about 2 years with doing my column Spitballing. Comes out every Friday on ball9.com, and we interview former major league players. It's that our goal is to bring fans stories, Major League Baseball stories directly from the players themselves. And a really neat thing is we've been able to interview guys between the age of 95 and in their mid 30s. So we've talked about the 1940s and every decade forward. So it's really neat to be able to talk to somebody and say, how'd you pitch to Jackie Robinson, or what was it like facing Stan Musial, things like that. And and then today, and we talk about current players, how the game's changed, and it's great. We've been able to talk to a lot of great people.
It's great. And on Ball 9, I mean, all those old interviews archived there, so people can go back and check some old episodes.
Yeah, they're all archived all the way back through the very first one, which was Al Ferrara, old Los Angeles Dodger player from the 50s. And like I said, it's been great. This week coming up, we have Bobby Witt Sr. So he's a cool perspective from him. He's talking about his time on the 1984 Olympics team, 16 years in the major leagues, and then even get into it with his son too, who's one of the top couple of prospects in baseball. So awesome interview, and thanks for asking about it.
Yeah, and it was actually a cool moment because I saw you actually tweeted that he was able to participate in the 2001 World Series. Obviously, it was against the Yankees, unfortunately, but it was cool because I remember this growing up as a kid. Bobby Witt, he would be like one of my Sega games. That's how far he goes back, and then just to see he was able to at least get a World Series ring. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it puts it in perspective a little bit. To me, they mentioned on the broadcast that was his last appearance, was Game 6 of the 01 World Series. He struck out Shane Spencer. And, they said, and I guess they knew he was going to be retiring after the season. And that was the last pitch he threw in the big leagues. And they said on the broadcast, he's from 1986 to 2001. And for me, 86 is special. I'm a Mets fan. Good of you to have a Mets fan on Talking Yankees here. But, just to see the link to 86, I was a young kid. 2001, I was an adult high school teacher at the time. So, to hear Bobby Witt's career span that whole time, but kind of put it in perspective. So you get a lot of neat stuff, a lot of neat stories, and really cool stuff.
And I'm sure I have a few of them, but I guess amount of all the spitballing, interviews you've done, are there like 2 or 3 that stand out, or just your favorite, were your favorite players to speak with?
Yeah, there was the one, like I mentioned, the older ones are really pretty great. The guys that are like in their 90s was phenomenal. Somebody like Al Worthington. He's just turned 93 years old the other day. He was one of the only, I think there's only about a dozen New York Giants baseball players that are still alive. So he's one of them. So it was a real treat to talk to him about pitching in the Polo Grounds in Ebbets Field, things like that. From a Yankee perspective, it was really cool to talk to Ron Blomberg, the first ever designated hitter, get his perspective on that. Another Yankee that was really neat to talk to. A couple other was great. Dennis Rasmussen, pitcher. From the 80s, and Mike Easler, the hitman before Don Mattingly was the hitman. And just these are guys that I watched, growing up, and guys that I collected their baseball cards. So those are some of the ones that stand out to me. And from a personal perspective, it was pretty neat. I'm, like I said, Mets fan. Anytime I get to talk to Mets, like Art Shamsky from the '69 Mets, or Glendon Rush, who's a really cool, an interesting guy to talk to, and Jay Hook, who's 85 years old and was the first ever Mets pitcher to record a win in 1962. So
Wow.
that was a really cool thing to talk to. And one of the neat things to talk to him with was, on a Yankee theme, his pitching coach was Red Ruffing on the 1962 Mets. So you're going all the way back to the Babe Ruth era, and it's just wild to me that I could say to somebody like, "Hey, what was it like to have Red Ruffing as your pitching coach?" And you get cool stuff like that. You get what it's like to be managed by Casey Stengel, and that's kind of what happened. Was Stengel brought in Red Ruffing and Rogers Hornsby as his hitting coach. His old guys he used to play with, like I said, in the Babe Ruth era. So interesting.
That's neat stuff. And again, all those interviews available on bull9.com. So let's get into your most recent book, Beyond Baseball's Color Barrier, where you look back at, the history of African-American Black baseball, the Negro Leagues going back from 1879 to present day. So what gave you the idea to, tell the story and, write about this topic?
It was good. My first book was published through Rowman and Littlefield, and it did okay and everything. And they reached out to me and said they wanted to, have a book on their files, about African-American history at Major League Baseball. And they just gave me the general topic and asked to come up with an idea about that. And I got to thinking of different ways to look into it, whether it was, just integration or just the modern day or looking into the future. And anyway, it snowballed into, I wanted to do a comprehensive timeline. So I couldn't really find any books that went all the way back, like you said, to 1879 to see the very, very first few professional African-American baseball players. Then see the controversy that led up to the color line being drawn, attempts made to erode the color line, and finally, Jackie Robinson breaking through. But then not just stop there, to show how African-American players have shaped the game, the personality they brought, and they really, I identify that time kind of, to put it in Yankee perspective, when the 60s became the 70s, when the era of Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris was winding down, and then, the 70s were starting with Mickey Rivers and Oscar Gamble and Reggie Jackson, and, lead into those late 70s Yankees teams. And you just, in that decade of, 1968, Mickey Mantle's final season, through, you just go 10 years later, 78 Yankees, Mantle season, they have Roy White, Al Downing, Horace Clark, of course, Roy White was, they're not superstars. Maybe Roy White was, but good players, but not huge personalities. Then you go a decade later, and like I mentioned, you have Reggie there, you have Willie Randolph, Mickey Rivers, Cliff Johnson, guys like that. And then it leads into Dave Winfield, Ricky Henderson, Mike Easler, we mentioned, and just kind of, want to capture that whole thing. And then the final part of the book examines the trends, how African-American participation has declined significantly in Major League Baseball. And, kind of takes a look into that, and then looks towards the future about how we can, how that can change. And, the percentages have stopped dropping. They have leveled off. They have even ticked up a little bit. So, things might be changing a little bit for the better.
And in terms of doing your research, did you get to interview some former players, just get their input on it?
I did. It was really interesting, to hear their perspective on different things. And for me, the biggest thing, again, coming back with a couple of Yankees, one of the first interviews I did was with Rudy May, who pitched for the Yankees, was the, I think, 1980 ERA champ. And he was telling me about his time in the minor leagues, how, when he was a minor league, he got signed by the Twins, and he learned later on that the scout that signed him didn't tell the Twins that he was a pitcher, because the Twins wouldn't sign African-American pitchers. Not a lot of clubs really would. They thought they were better athletes. They'd be, better off in different positions. So the scout had put his reputation on the line and pretty much said, like, yeah, maybe they're going to freak out when they see he's an African-American pitcher, but once they see him pitch, they'll let him, they'll see his talent. And that guy kind of risked it, and it worked. But then Rudy's telling me the stories of him being in the minor leagues and the white players have a water fountain in the dugout. The black players had a pail of water behind the dugout with a ladle, and they all had to, drink from the same ladle out of this, dirty water that's been sitting there in the South all day. And to hear that story directly from somebody, that's not something that happened to somebody 80 years ago. That's somebody that pitched during our generation of watching baseball. So that kind of hit home, and that's why I wanted those personal stories. And another Yankee I talked to as well was Andre Robertson. If you remember, he was shortstop in the 80s, pre-Derek Jeter. Was a big prospect. He got in a car accident and what never really panned out. He never really recovered from that. But he's somebody that played in the 80s that I watched as a kid, and he was the first African-American baseball player to get a scholarship at the University of Texas, a full scholarship. So to see that those barriers still existed for players that you and I watched, put into perspective that this is something that's new. The things sound like they might be stories from a whole different era, the 20s or 30s, but they really aren't. These are things that happened in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and different obstacles today. But again, so that was a big part of the book, was interviewing some former players.
Yeah, actually kind of leads into one of the questions I was going to have, that, yeah, even like 20, 30 years after the game's integrated, were there other forms of discrimination that players had to go through, whether it was from teammates, ownership? Obviously fans are going to say stupid things once in a while, especially in certain cities, but but was there other forms of discrimination that you uncovered, just speaking for other players?
Yeah, there was, and out of the players I spoke with, and it was only about a dozen or so, they did say that their own teammate, they never, again, it was the guys that I spoke with, none of them had ever had any problem with any teammates. There were a lot of narratives, from what I found, where they thought there would be some animosity if an African-American player took a white player's job, and that never really came up among teammates with the people that I talked to. But then that obstacle was there. One obstacle was dealing with the press that some of the players had talked about, where you did have, in the 50s and 60s, these old school baseball reporters who had that same mentality of, the old school owners who were there to protect and have that narrative that African Americans were somehow less than. I mentioned with Rudy May, African Americans shouldn't be pitchers, things like that. So that was a big part of it. The players I talked to did talk about fans. Minor leagues seem to be a lot more rough than the major leagues, from what I remember being told. And just that the general racism that's still around, to this day, where you're always going to run into people who are looking down on people because of the color of their skin, and that was no different, back then than it was today.
Again, the book, it's called Beyond Baseball's Color Barriers, available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and plus your previous title, 50 Moments That Define Major League Baseball, also available on Amazon. So you can definitely check that out. So I'm interested in reading the description of the book. That looks like there was sort of a little anonymous pre-survey amongst players about integrating the game much earlier than it did, and it seemed like a lot of people were in favor of it.
That was one. I'm glad you brought that up. That was one of my most revealing moments of the book, I would say, for me in doing my research. That was something I just happened to come across in doing my research. I hadn't planned it out when I was doing my proposal or anything, but it was, you're mentioning the Pittsburgh Courier survey, which happened in the early 1940s by a gentleman named Wendell Smith. He was a writer for the Pittsburgh Courier, a very respected sports writer. And the Pittsburgh Courier was an all African-American newspaper, not just sports, just a general publication that covered African-American history and goings on in sports. So he surveyed every single National League team. He talked to every manager and a sampling of players from each team. And some teams were, 2 or 3 guys participated. Some teams, a ton of them did. But it was, the things that were striking to me was, it was absolutely unanimous that every single player of that time said, there are plenty of African-American players who have the talent and ability to play Major League Baseball. These guys were having comments about going to watch the Negro Leagues on their own, which I thought was really interesting. And these are big time players that they interviewed. Honus Wagner, Pie Traynor, Dizzy Dean, Gabby Hartnett. These are Hall of Famers that Wendell Smith interviewed, which again goes to show you the respect that he had. But, not one person. Dizzy Dean had some question about whether the cities themselves would be accepting of African-American players, which was fair, I thought. But what was also interesting to me was not one of them mentioned Commissioner Landis. And that was a different part of the book as well. They all pointed the fingers at the owners, including the managers as well. The managers all said, well, they'll manage whoever they put in their dugout, and it kind of showed me that the roles were a lot more defined back then. The players played, the managers managed whoever was there, the owners did whatever they want because it was their team, and the commissioner enforced the rules. So everybody had their role and played in it. It didn't really blend together the way it does today. So what I got out of that survey was the owners, Commissioner Landis played a big role, and he's a symbolic figure of the segregation, and he, without question deserves, I think, that, the negative stuff that goes his way for not integrating the game. But to make him the singular figure, I think is unfair, because I think that takes some of the onus off of the owners, who were really the ones keeping the league segregated.
Yeah, so I kind of going to ask you, just beyond the front office, what was the holdup? So I guess ownership as well probably had a hand in that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was ownership, and there was another part that I kind of get into, and I got to interview Bob Kendrick, who was the president of the Negro Leagues Hall of Fame. Was a fantastic interview I had, and what was interesting to me was the business side of it. So a lot of the Negro Leagues teams played in the major league stadiums. So the Pirates would go on the road for a road trip, and then Pirates ownership would rent Forbes Field out to the Pittsburgh Crawfords and the Negro League team. So instead of the stadium staying empty, there's another baseball game team in there. They're drawing fans, they're making money. The deals that the owners had, the rental deals were unfair towards the Negro League teams, but the Negro League teams wanted these big stadiums to play because people wanted to see them. They drew crowds. So there's that business aspect of it where if if the leagues integrated, everybody knew that the Negro Leagues would go away, which meant all those, the teams that were renting out stadiums would lose all that income. So aside from the racial aspect of it, there was that business side of it too. And in talking to Bob Kendrick about that, we talked about the relationship with Judge Landis and Rube Foster, who was, that huge figure in Negro League baseball. And he mentioned that the two of them had a great relationship. It wasn't animosity. It wasn't, problems. They kind of worked together to try to put that in order. And there was a motion at the time that was saying, instead of integrating Major League Baseball, why don't we make the Negro Leagues, support them, make them stronger, make them bigger, give them more resources. So that it's a very complex situation. And my goal in my book was to try to put all the information out there without being judgmental, to try to let the readers kind of decide for themselves where they want to put blame or credit, or how they want to interpret all that information.
Right. And you just mentioned, where the game is now and in the future. And again, I think African American participation kind of either shrank or wavered a little bit. You think it's maybe part of the problem that it hasn't been any stars like they could look like? So say, I think like Ken Griffey Jr. was kind of a really missed opportunity with his injuries. I think he could have got a lot of young kids into the game. And then even though Barry Bonds was there and crushing home runs, I guess like his personality is just not really that friendly. So maybe people couldn't really gravitate to him. You just think maybe because there's not really an idol for young kids to look up to?
That's an awesome point. And again, the participation is a multi-level, multi-layered problem. And that's one of the main points that I've talked about on a lot of these interviews that I've done, is that's what I think is needed. Baseball has done a lot of good stuff with the RBI program, reviving baseball in the inner cities, urban youth development program. Those grassroots efforts, I think, are making inroads in the inner cities, where it's so much easier to just go play basketball or football. You don't have to, baseball is a country club sport is kind of what we're saying. So I think the progress baseball has made has leveled off that participation. It has stopped dropping at about 8% of the league. So it stopped dropping over the past 5 or 6 years. Now I think there needs something to jumpstart it. And to me, that's my answer too. Kind of the way Tiger Woods did for golf, or Michael Jordan did for basketball. You mentioned Griffey. That's somebody I mentioned as well too. You know, again, remember as kids when he first came up, I mean, he lit the world on fire. Everybody playing baseball with their hat backwards because Ken Griffey Jr. did. You know, that's kind of what I think baseball needs at this point. It would have been nice to see, you know, somebody like Mookie Betts be that kind of person. But for whatever reason, it's, you know, I don't know if it's marketing or what, but it didn't happen with him. So there's some great African American young players, you know, that have come up that are in the minor leagues that have been top draft picks in the past few years. So we need somebody to light the world on fire and, you know, have kids sitting there in the playground saying, man, you know, I want to be that guy. And it's a baseball player.
Yeah, because I just remember just myself growing up when we were playing wiffle ball, like we all wanted to be Don Mattingly, just, you know, it made us want to play wiffle ball. So I just think that would help the game. You know, if someone like that could emerge, like a Mookie Betts would be a perfect example. So again, the book, Beyond Baseball's Color Barrier, again, people can check it out on Amazon. So a little time left. Let's just get into some contemporary. Obviously, the game is still locked down with the owners and players union kind of going back and forth. So I kind of been tuned out a little bit. Can you just give a quick summary of like what's the holdup here?
It's, you know, it's always the same thing. And I've been through, I'm old enough now. I've seen the 81 strike and the 94 work stoppage and a couple work stoppages here and there. To me, it's always been the same type of thing. It's all the animosity back and forth, a lot of stuff in the media. I've believed from day one that spring training was not going to happen on time. I still don't think it is. Maybe I'm being pessimistic, but I don't think the regular season's going to start on time. To me, it's just a matter of whether it's going to be a few weeks of a delay, you know, to get them up and running in spring training, or is it going to cut a significant amount of time or, you know, chunk out of the season? I think the major, I mean, again, it's very complex, but to put it into simple terms, the players to me don't seem like they're asking for a ton of stuff. You know, they you know, want their minimums increased. They don't want teams tanking. And they have other wants that they have behind the scenes too, but those are the main things. And the owners just, to me, seem willing to not to compromise. And, you know, for me, I always kind of side with the players, but, you know, both sides are at fault. And the fans get caught in the middle. It's the same song and dance every time. And, you know, progress will be made at some point. At some point, they'll be playing baseball. And this will all be behind us. It just kind of stinks to be going through it right now.
And I just think the effect of, you know, just it almost reminds me of 2020 with the COVID season, the way it got shifted late. And I think players maybe weren't up to par and you saw some injuries. I just hope it's not the case, you know, for 2022. So, you know, we recently had the most recent Hall of Fame vote, very controversial in terms of, all right, the last go around for Clemens and Bonds. Were you shocked that they didn't get in? And, you know, within the same year, are you shocked that Poppy got in first ballot, but not A-Rod? But when supposedly they both might have flunked that 2003, you know, secret test for the PEDs.
Right. You know, it's turned into such a convoluted thing, and it's such a shame because I love the Hall of Fame. Go there multiple times. I study it. You know, can sit there and name 200 baseball Hall of Famers off the top of my head. So it's disheartening to me to see what it's become, where it's basically, you know, it's the steroid controversy. It's people arguing about ballots. There's like nothing positive about it until it gets to the ceremony, and then it's all nice and cool. So that's kind of tough for me. With the steroids, I didn't think Bonds and Clemens would get in. Kevin Kernan, who writes for Ball 9, brought up a great point a couple of years ago. He had said, you know, he had the feeling that the writers were just kind of passing it along to the players. You know, the writers are covering, they're the voters. You get 10 years on the ballot. The writers weren't putting those guys in. So in essence, they're punting it off to the players, to those committees, and say, if you players want these steroid guys in the Hall of Fame, you know, you could be the ones to put them in. So, you know, which I get. It's not a big deal. You know, to me, and I'm a small Hall of Fame guy, but, you know, cheaters, not cheaters, whatever. It's hard to discern. You see everybody now says there are people who did steroids that are in the Hall of Fame. You see former players do that. They won't name names, but there are steroid guys that are in there. That's pretty much a given at this point. So for now, for me, to have a Hall of Fame without A-Rod or Barry Bonds or Clemens or these guys doesn't seem right. I am on the fence about them, but I think they'll get in, and they deserve to get in for what they did on the field. They're great players. I thought Ortiz might have to wait a year or two the way Piazza did, and not lumping Piazza in with Ortiz because it's different circumstances and stuff. But I thought that he might have to wait a year or two, but his play on the field deserved it. For me, in Ortiz's defense, he had that failed early test on the survey thing, which there's question about false positives and what they were testing for. But he got tested, very well throughout his career, never suspended. So for me, I think that's why he gets a pass, and maybe A-Rod and Manny and guys like that don't.
Not true. And I think it plus helps with Ortiz. It just seems like the riders, or at least everyone's more, gleeful towards him. He's got the 3 championships with the Red Sox, including the 2004 one, which was like the big, slaying of the dragon. So I think that, the postseason also helped him as well. And plus having over 500 home runs, of course, which is usually, again, more or less a shoe-in to get you into the Hall of Fame.
For sure. And, the thing just in my own head when I start thinking about judging and this and that, Ken Burns' documentary Baseball is great. That's one of my favorite things. What I try to think about is if he was doing a section, as he's going through the sections, is he going to spend a lot of time on somebody? So if you're telling the story of those mid-2000s, the 04 Red Sox team is going to play a big role, and so is David Ortiz and Manny. And if you're talking about just the evolution of the DH position in Major League Baseball, Ortiz is there. And he's got the numbers and everything to back it all up too. So it's that old adage, can you tell the story of baseball with or without this person? And not that that's the overall deciding factor, but that's a big thing for me. He's Ortiz, and the way A-Rod is too, and Bonds and Clemens. These are guys, if I took my nephew to the Baseball Hall of Fame 20 years from now and started pointing out plaques, those are guys that I would be telling stories about. So I think those guys should be in.
I agree with you. And I think for whether they get voted in or through the players, at some point, I think all 4 will, of course, Poppy's already in, but I think A-Rod will get in eventually, because I think this over time, I think there's going to be more lenient. And of course, I think players would recognize Bonds and Clemens. So I agree. At some point, I think they'll all be in there. So Rocco, again, appreciate your time. Again, people could follow you on Twitter, official MLB RFC, as well as check out your website, roccoconstantino.com. And of course, check out ball9.com and Spitballing, your weekly show, interviewing a lot of former players. So appreciate to have you on. Now, you're a Met fan, so not going to hold it against you, but thank you for coming on.